Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the 5 year celebration of the Fort Collins Book Fest. My name is Matt Stillwell. I am English faculty at Front Range Community College, and I'm happy to be here with you this evening for our session on the ancient art of brewing with corn, and also a pre-recorded tour of Dos Luces Brewery in Denver. So I want to welcome you all this evening. Today, again, we're celebrating our first 5 years of the Fort Collins Book Festival, which is a virtual celebration of books and brews, writings and riffs, food and thought, big science, and the great outdoors. As always, we are also celebrating the importance of literature, writing, books, and of course, our libraries. Please check out the virtual program at www.focobookfest.org. We have book talks, discussions, panels, prose, and poetry readings, all free. So if you're coming back after our first weekend, or if you missed our first weekend and you're here for the second weekend, please stay tuned and check out our offerings. Make sure you attend as many of these sessions as you can and continue to share our link with family and friends. Before we get to our session this evening, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This festival could not happen without our generous sponsors. Today's event is produced by Poudre River Public Library District in partnership with the CSU Morgan Library. Our presenting sponsor is the City of Fort Collins Fort Fund, and further support has been provided by Friends of the Poudre Library District, Friends of Morgan Library, the Lila B. Morgan Endowment Fund, Downtown Development Authority, Liggett, Johnson and Goodman, PC, Front Range Community College, the Downtown Fort Collins Creative District, Old Firehouse Books, and our media partners, KUNC and 105.5, the Colorado Sound. We'd like to give a special thanks to the Northern Colorado writers for presenting all 4 of our writers' workshops. Please, everyone, virtually, thank you for thanking them. And also to you who are tuning in this evening, thank you so much for supporting our 5th annual FOCO Book Festival. Now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening's session, John Wilson. As the son of a brewer and the grandson of a brewer and bootlegger, John Wilson has been brewing for over 20 years. While spending almost a decade living and working abroad, John developed a passion for traditional fermentation techniques. As a result, he joined the Fermentation Science program at Colorado State University. John is currently a graduate student in CSU's Department of Food Science, researching methods of traditional fermentation and how they can be integrated into modern food systems. So welcome, John. Thank you for being here tonight. It's nice to meet you through Zoom, and go ahead and take it away, after which I'll be moderating a question and answer session.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now so that we can look at my presentation. And if everyone sees me kind of look down and to my right, it's because I'm keeping an eye on time and want to make sure I give you guys enough time to ask the questions that might arise during the discussion. Can everybody see my screen here? All right. Oops. Oh, for some reason, it's jumped over to the right here. Okay, there we go. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture aspects of fermentation. And some of you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with literature? But I think that, it's really important when you're reading and exploring different types of literature in cultures that are not familiar to your own culture. Understanding these things will help you gain a better viewpoint of how these practices kind of drive the narrative of the story, the cultures that you may experience while you're reading that story, and the impact of the character development as it moves along. And so hopefully during the course of this discussion, you'll get a better sense of that. To start this talk, I just want to introduce my family. On the left-hand side, this is my maternal great-grandmother. She brewed country wine during the Depression, and she ran a juke joint. And so, as you can kind of tell from that picture, it was a very lucrative business during a time where people were struggling, as kind of we all are now. And it was really kind of the heart of what supported our family during the early 20th century. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of my dad. Now, this is a guy who taught me how to brew, and he's the son of a brewer and a bootlegger. And he's the grandson of a bootlegger as well, and a Pentecostal preacher. So kind of the lore in our family is that my great-grandfather would give you the good book in the front and the good stuff in the back. But this is the kind of thing that really pulled our family together. And as I was learning to brew, because my father traveled a lot for his professional job. And so these times standing around the kettle were really the only times that I got to kind of get to know my father and my grandfather. And so these are really important to me. So I went to college, to Morehouse College. I studied English literature there. I got a BA with a minor in music, cello performance. And after college, I went to Japan. And this was the first time I really lived in a culture where fermentation was kind of at the heart of the cuisine. And so the town that I lived in was called Kanazawa. And in Kanazawa, they have a meeting of this kind of bustling, urban, developed world that we associate with Japan today and the old traditional Japan. And so in my neighborhood, we had traditional fermenters of a variety of kinds, and I'll mention that later on in our discussion. After my time in Japan, I went to Australia, to Bonn University, and I got a master's degree in international relations and African development. And that led me to join the US Peace Corps, where I was a small enterprise developer working at a international slave site and then an international natural history site. And so there I was kind of there to help the communities develop their tourism industry, to get people to come and see and experience the history that was going there. And Ghana is also a place where we have a lot of fermentation traditions. It's a tropical country, and so food spoils very quickly. So without fermentation, people wouldn't be able to kind of set food aside for the long run. After I left Ghana, I went to work for the Department of Agriculture, but I ended up landing at Population Services International. And this is a public health nonprofit. And my area of research was primarily HIV and reproductive health. And so while I was there, I was tasked to kind of go into these communities. And I was told, okay, you have this job, you have this goal when you hit this community. So I would go in and I'd say, okay, show me what you're fermenting. Show me what's going on here. And so I would find somebody who could teach me a local ferment. And then I would give it a try and show it to the community. And the community would all come out to see what this foreigner has done. And while they were laughing at my expense, I was delivering my message. And this served two things. One, it was acknowledging that I was arriving into a space where I didn't have all the knowledge, where I was acknowledging that there are things that are important in this community that I don't understand. And then I was also acknowledging, hey, look, since this is important, I'm going to try to make it important for me. And because fermenting takes time, and learning how to ferment takes time with these opinion leaders, it really took me a while to sit down and spend some dedicated, focused time with these community members. And so I was able to be more effective in my job in this organization. And this brings me back to my kids. So I would come home and I would teach my children these methods of fermentation. And when you think about culture and fermentation, this is what we're talking about. So we're not just talking about the conservation of resources. We're talking about the time to hand down traditions from one generation to the next. And in order to do that, it's not a rapid process. It's a process that takes hours, it takes days, it takes weeks. In some cases, it takes months or years. And so this helps solidify cultural bonds, family bonds, to make it a cohesive activity that helps unite a community. So after years of working in public health, my wife said, hey, you're spending more time focusing on these ferments than you're learning than you are really on public health. Is this something you'd like to go into? And I said, actually, I would love to do this. So we ended up moving to Colorado, and I joined the fermentation science program at Colorado State University. And afterwards, I passed through the program and I joined the graduate program as a food scientist. So we're going to continue this conversation with a little bit of thought experiment. And this is one of my favorite things to do with my students. So I want you to imagine, as you are tucking yourselves in tonight and after you fall asleep, that when you wake up inside of a cave and it's complete darkness. You don't know where you are. The surroundings is unfamiliar and you're afraid, and your first instinct might be to call out to someone, to call out to help. And way off in the distance, you hear someone calling back. And maybe the two of you continue to call to each other, and finally, yeah, you meet up with each other in the dark and you feel a little bit of relief. And suddenly you realize that you have different skills that you can apply to help kind of get yourselves out of the situation. And so while you're applying those skills, you continue to call out to more people and your community grows. And as your community grows, you start to build structures. And you realize that you have resources around your structures that will help you to sustain your community. And as you continue to call out and you continue to grow, you start to build infrastructure. And within that infrastructure, you build waterways to bring water in. You build roads to bring nutrients in. You start to bring channels or sewers to leave your waste out. And then maybe you decide, hey, look, we have a good foundation here. Let's build some walls around our community to protect ourselves. So you start to build walls. And then you're going to need a soldier class to stand outside those walls and defend the community. And over time, as the resources deplete, maybe large groups of your community decide, you know, it's been great here, but we want to leave and we want to go somewhere else to see if there's something new outside of our community where we can maybe start something new and we can maintain that relationship. And what you have here is this kind of description of the rise of human civilization. And so when we think about ourselves as a culture, this development of human culture, this is a pretty basic way to think about how human culture developed. But what I would suggest is that this is also a way that culture exists on a microbial level. So if you think about developing a kombucha, where you add a little bit of a SCOBY or a little bit of the last year's kombucha to a fresh tea, the same things happens to the microorganisms in that kombucha. They find themselves in an unfamiliar place and they don't know where they are and they're not sure what's going on. And so you have this lag period where the microbes are kind of freaking out because they're not sure exactly what's happening to them. And so some of them will start to call out to each other. And they'll do this by a biochemical shout in the dark. They're saying, hey, is there anyone else like us in this environment? And then maybe if that biochemical shout in the dark hits another bacterium or fungus, they will call back. And soon enough, you'll start to see movement. Those that are able to move themselves will move towards each other. And those that are unable to move on their own will divide and grow in the direction of those biochemical shouts in the dark. And we call this quorum sensing. And when you get enough of these organisms together, they will start to realize that they have a symbiotic relationship. So maybe one organism can convert sugars from carbohydrates into alcohol, and while another organism will take that alcohol and convert it into to acetic acid, or what we know as vinegar. And then they'll start to build walls. And instead of building walls out of brick and mortar like we as humans do, they'll build walls out of blocks of cellulose. And this is what we call a SCOBY. So if anybody who's ever done kombucha or grown kombucha, you'll see this kind of thick, mucousy hockey puck on the top of their culture. This is a SCOBY. And so these SCOBYs are cellulose walls that these bacteria and yeast will build around themselves. And within these walls, they'll build channels that bring water and nutrients in, and they'll build other channels that funnel out their waste products. And then they'll even have different types of bacterium that inhabit the outside of the SCOBY to defend against invading microorganisms. And then over a long enough time, as resources begin to deplete, groups of these bacteria and yeast will peel off of that SCOBY together in a search for additional resources. So while on the one hand, we have the rise of human civilization in the formation of, in the development rising up out of Africa, we see the same thing every single day. We are refreshing our SCOBYs, our home ferments, when we're at home. So a little bit of the objectives today. We would like to recognize the distinction between inherent and cultural notions of acceptance and rejection. We want to gain an understanding a role of fermentation in human development. We want to illustrate the diversity of global fermentation techniques and draw connections between traditional fermentation techniques and Western brewing processes. And ultimately, the goal is to inspire everyone to kind of try some of these things out. It's one thing to read about tempeh and to see pictures and to look at it online. It's another thing to kind of make it on your own and recognize what this could mean for a community as it moves on. So let's talk a little bit about our acceptance and rejection. So some things that affected our health, your perceived ethical and environmental appropriateness. So people who choose to be vegetarian or vegan may fall into that category. Availability, we eat what's available. We eat what we can get our hands on. Convenience. Can you go to the store and buy it, or do you have to drive 100 miles or whatever, like I sometimes do, to Denver to get specialty items? In terms of taste, there are fixed biological responses and there are learned responses. So fixed responses are kind of the five main flavors, right? Sour, anybody who has children who's ever given them a lemon to bite, that is a universal face that young humans make when they taste something sour. Sweet, salty, bitter, umami. We all have these kind of universal preferences, these instinctual reactions to these flavors as children or infants. And then we have learned food responses. So things like, harkarl, which you see kind of up at the top here, this fermented Icelandic shark, or some people's preference to spicy foods or not, or even blue stinky cheeses. This goes on to textures, things like crispness, the crunchiness of an apple, the crispness of a spring roll, the oiliness of a good soup. These represent things inherently, universally, that this food is fresh, that this food is safe to eat, and this food is nutrient rich. And then you have cultural preferences, nutriently dense. And then you have cultural preferences like natto and zalada, pana salada, and biltong, where they're slimy or soggy or super drying in the mouth, where you don't inherently, these trigger our inherent notions of rejection, but cultures have developed to appreciate them for nutritious reasons. And then things like culture and things like color. So you have small changes in color up in the top left here with the eggs. You have on the left, you have a European egg. It's dark, it's orange. This is the color of egg that's preferred in Europe. And so what they'll do is they'll augment the feed of the chickens to include lots of beta carotenes that will be present in that egg. And here in the center, we have the American egg that's classic. We eat like a pale grain-fed egg. But over the years, we've been shifting towards this egg on the right, which is a combination of the two. We like a nice pale egg, but we love a little color to give the perception of health. The same thing goes with butter. In the two sticks of butter on the left, you have an American stick of butter. On the right, you have a European stick of butter. And the only difference is the feed that the animals are given. So producers in both cultures will augment the feed to adjust for consumer preference. And then the next picture is ghee. It's clarified butter. And so here you have the milk solids removed at all. And this is popular in South Asia, so that you're only having the milk fats that you can cook with. And things like color as well can be learned. So blueberries in and of themselves, we don't have very many fruits or foods in human culture that are naturally or inherently blue. So blueberries are one of the rare exceptions. But then you've got the blue represents spoilage and rot for most communities. And so when we see blue, we're hardwired to reject that food because our human experience has taught us that blue means spoilage. And then you have here a century egg, which is a 100-year-old egg from China, where you have this bluish green, which signifies rot, but culture has taught people that this is a great way to preserve eggs, which is a solid protein source. So, cultural acceptance also comes in combinations. Beans and rice is very popular in the Western Hemisphere, but in the East, beans are often sweetened and used as a dessert. Peanut butter and jelly is a ubiquitous American food, but most of the world rejects this notion of peanut butter and jelly, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a community that would embrace it as Americans do. Peanut butter is often used as a result as a savory dish in West and Southern Africa and Southeast Asia. Here in the West, we drink a lot of fresh milk, but milk is often combined with blood to make it more nutritious and dense for the community, to support the community without killing the cow. And so I'm from Georgia, I'm from the South. So grits, which are a ground corn porridge, are often savory, but then you have crazy people who choose to put sugar on their grits. And my aversion to sugar on grits is so deep. My grandfather used to say about anybody who was crazy, he would say, that boy sugars his grits, because that was a way of him indicating that this was someone who didn't adhere to the cultural norms. So taste development starts as in infancy. So when we're young, studies have shown that mothers who eat lots of vegetables during pregnancy will rear children who prefer vegetables. As mammals, human beings, the food that the mother consumes a lot of taste of those foods are often transferred into our breast milk. Later, as culture starts to change our taste preferences, when we're kids. So kids start looking around at what their friends are eating and they want to eat that. And then you really don't get choice over your food until you're a young adult. And this is when you start to make choices for yourself. Maybe you choose to be a vegetarian, or you choose to immerse yourself in a certain cuisine. And then as you age, your food choices are kind of limited by the process of aging. Maybe you can't consume as many oils as you used to, or the spices that you used to eat, or maybe you can't chew the foods you used to be able to chew. And so aging kind of dictates a lot of those processes. So two other things that affect food choice are appetite. And this could be affected by the last thing we ate. Oh, I've eaten hamburgers for 2 days in a row. I don't want to eat any more hamburgers. Or eating habits. Maybe you're a vegetarian or you're a meatitarian or you're somewhere in between. The time of day, right? You don't eat steak in the morning, or maybe you don't eat coffee bread or coffee cake in the evening, and your surroundings. If you're standing at a 4th of July picnic, what would your food choices be versus when you're standing at a Thanksgiving or a Christmas dinner? And then your physical and psychological choices. When you're sick, you're probably not going to want to eat a greasy barbecue meal. And then also psychologically, depression can affect food choices, and also eating disorders, things like anorexia and bulimia, and the spectrum that lies in between those two can also affect the way that you choose food. Now, fermentation is so inherent in human culture that you can see it in almost every religion in the history of human culture. So in the ancient world, we kind of start with Nkasi. A lot of people have heard of this. This is the goddess of beer. She's also the goddess of desire, but I think more importantly, she's the goddess of what you truly need. So there's this recommendation that fermentation practices are important and fundamental to human culture. After Nkasi, you have the rise of Silenus, who was the god of beer and the father of Dionysus. So you see this connection between the consumption of beer and wisdom, and of course, the joyous nature of alcoholic beverages. And then Dionysus was the god of the grape, of the harvest and wine. He was also the god of fertility and religious ecstasy. So you get this recognition that consuming alcohol will kind of put you in a state where you can connect with the gods. In parallel, you have the god Osiris, who's the god of beer and the god of the underworld, but he's also the god of resurrection. So in the mythological story of Osiris was chopped up into multiple pieces, he was killed, and then his wife put him back together, and he's the god of resurrection. And what could be a more apt metaphor for beer for ancient people? You're taking a substance that looks inert, and all of a sudden it comes to life with bubbles in that act of fermentation. And even in the New World, and this is a name that I have struggled to pronounce, Tezcatlipoca, the god of pulque, drunkenness, and again, you get fertility. So here you have these ancient religions that are kind of universally deifying this act of fermentation as integral to their cultures. In the Abrahamic tradition, in Judaism, fermentation represents the connections to home and stability. So the lack of these products signifies the displacement of Jewish diaspora. So, if you think about it in terms of the Old Testament, when you're reading these types of stories, you're reading the story of a displaced people. And so we couldn't stay in one place long enough to ferment bread, to make wine. These are really powerful notions that help kind of drive the enduring traditions of the Jewish culture. In Christianity, the sacred components of the Christian community are both products of fermentation. You have wine, which is a fermented product, and you have bread. And so it's no coincidence that these types of things became the ownership of the priests in the Middle Ages. Because again, just like Osiris, what better metaphor for resurrection than an inert substance that comes alive with fermentation? And then in the religion of Islam, you have a recognition of divisions of ferments, where these ferments are culture promoting and these ferments are culture destructive. And so you have this idea where we have these practices that can help build up our culture, and then other practices that can tear them down. So we've been talking a lot about fermentation. So let's kind of dig into what exactly is fermentation. So we have several different definitions here. Sandor Katz, who wrote a wonderful book called The Art of Fermentation, defines it as the transformative act of microorganisms. And then the World Gastronomy Organization talks about it as a process in which microorganisms transform food and other products, usually through production of lactic acid, ethanol, or metabolic end products. And then zymology, which is a definition of the study of fermentation, has its roots in Louis Pasteur, which was the first zymologist when he connected yeast to fermentation. All right, so now fermentation's role in human development. Fermentation is kind of helped facilitate humanity's transition from hunting and gathering to cultivation and food storage. And so what that basically did is it allowed human beings to take resources that were of high value, high nutrient density, and they could pack them away in times where they were lean. And so you have this rise of community. So a lot of people have seen kind of the bread hypothesis or the beer hypothesis and the development of human civilization. And that is rooted, both of those are rooted in this idea of fermentation. And so what do people ferment? And what you mostly see in cultures is people ferment what's important to them. They see these substrates and they say, this is something that is important to the health and the promotion of our communities. And we are going to need this on the long run, or we're going to need this later on when it's no longer naturally available. So let's talk a little bit about a few types of fermentation. And so the first one I want to talk about is harkarl. This is a fermented Icelandic shark, Greenland shark. And so I think most people kind of have heard of this, or it's apocryphal in a lot of ways on YouTube and on Google. But basically they take this shark that has no kidneys, and so therefore it builds up a lot of urea in its flesh tissues. And so when people were to eat it fresh, they were to get kind of intoxicated, but not in a pleasant way, in a very unpleasant way during consumption. And so it would be buried in the ground and pressed, and that urea would be broken down basically into ammonia. And ammonia is kind of the dominant flavor of harkarl. And so the purpose of this fermentation is to detoxify the flesh and to preserve food. But if you think about where Iceland is, this is a large island that is absent of mammals. It doesn't have a lot of protein sources outside of the sea. And so if you were to capture a Greenland shark, you wouldn't just throw it away because you couldn't consume it. It wasn't safe to eat fresh. So people had to find a way to detoxify it so that it would be safe to consume without making their population sick. And so while a mouthful of rotting fishy ammonia might not be, ideal for those of us in the modern West, it's something that is a tradition that has helped maintain the population in the island of Iceland for many years. In the same scope, you have stinkheads in the indigenous people of Alaska. And this is the same idea. You have lots of salmon that are being caught during a very short time of the year. And these salmon heads and body parts are buried in the ground to ferment, and they're buried underneath the permafrost. So that keeps the temperature of that fermentation very low. And again, the dominant flavors are ammonia and what we would associate as rot. And the purpose is food presentation, this presentation of protein during lean times. We have nampla. This is another type of fish ferment, but this is in Southeast Asia, where small fish are kept with their gut pouches intact. And these fish are salted and fermented in the sun, and the liquid is run off and collected. And you get a lot of salty umami flavors. So those of us who have ever eaten Thai food or Vietnamese food, this is the predominant flavor. This is what holds up the flavors of those foods. And this isn't uniquely a Southeast Asian theme. During the Roman Empire, they used to produce a similar product called garum. And it was made out of fermented fish, and it was used as a condiment kind of over everything. Here we have the 100-year egg. So, most of the time when we think about fermentation, we think about microbial fermentation. But in the food science world, we also have a chemical fermentation. And so this is where 100-year or century eggs come in. And the eggs can be duck or chicken or quail eggs. And these eggs are soaked in ash or quicklime. So this is a basic or with a pH of above 7. Fermentation over 3 months, and these preserve the eggs. So if you can imagine in cultures where chicken's primary resource or the primary value of a chicken is in the eggs, right? As long as you have a chicken, you have eggs to eat. But sometimes you have a lot of chickens and you want to preserve those eggs. So this was a way of maintaining that source of protein over a long period of time, or stocking those in reserves. So the flavors are kind of ammonia and strong cheese, a little bit of sulfur. We can actually get these eggs here in Fort Collins at a couple of the Asian markets. There's one on Drake and shields that carries them occasionally. And I've also seen them in King Supers, believe it or not. And while, the descriptions of these flavors may sound off-putting, the yolk is my favorite part. It's super creamy, it's unctuous, and it's really pleasant to eat, despite the disgust that may be inherent in that greenish, pussy color. Next, we're going to take a look at lutefisk. This is another chemical ferment where you have a salt cod that has been processed through lye over 10 days. And it's an alkaline chemical reaction that makes the amino acids in that fish more bioavailable to human beings. It has a very mild fish flavor, and it's really done to improve texture and flavor. So in a culture where people tend to scarify or chip or carve their teeth, something like a lutefisk would be more readily available. Here we have natto. This is something we looked at previously when we talked about texture. And these are soybeans that are incubated for 24 to 36 hours. And it promotes kind of this umami, viscous texture and this slimy slimy coating that's on the outside of beans that is primarily used for preservation of resources, in this case, soybeans, flavor, and health. So nattokinase, which is an enzyme that is present in the slimy covering of these beans, has been shown to improve cardiovascular health in multiple studies. And you can even see variations on this theme in terms of fermented beverage substrates. So here we have a new world ingredient introduced into Western Africa. So this is banku. This is fermented corn and cassava meal. And it's fermented to make the nutrients more bioavailable. So fermenting corn helps make B vitamins more bioavailable, and it makes it a more nutritious substance. On the other hand, you have kenkey, and kenkey is again the same type of substrate, but it's used in two different ways. So you have ga kenkey, which is here at the bottom in these corn husks, which is designed to be eaten fresh, which is solely cornmeal that has been fermented and steamed in these corn husks, much like the tamales here in the New World. And then you have fanti kenkey, which is fermented and steamed in banana leaves, and it's packed tightly, and it's intended to be carried and walked away long distances, and you can eat it either hot or cold. And again, the reason of this ferment is flavor, nutrition, and preservation. Next, we have cassava, which is made out of gari, which is made out of cassava tubers. And so there are certain types of cassava that are toxic. And so the fermentation can kind of break down those toxic compounds to make it a little safe to eat. And so the cassava is fermented and ground up. In South America, we have cuño, which are a type of potato which are high in toxic alkaloids. And potatoes are members of the nightshade family, which are inherently poisonous. And so these products are freeze dried, and they are fermented kind of up above in high altitudes, and then they're rinsed in a river where the toxic alkaloids are kind of washed away, and then it can be eaten like a standard potato. We have poi in Polynesia, which is made out of taro root, and taro root has a certain type of acid in it that can be irritating to the throat if you were to eat it raw. But fermenting that kind of breaks down that acid and allows for us to access it in a nutritious way. To slip over into the alcoholic beverages, we have palm wine. Palm wine is taken from the sap of a palm tree, and this is all over the tropics. You could anywhere where palm trees are found, Africa and Asia. And that sap is spontaneously fermented from the yeast that are present around the outside of the tree. And the only purpose to drink this is fun. And it tastes a lot like an alcoholic apple cider. And then some varieties have a little sulfury tip to them. Pito, which is one of my favorites, and this is in West Africa, is a millet beer. And what's really special about Pito is you have this recognition that there are times of the day where people can drink this beer. So in the morning when the beer is fresh and it hasn't started to ferment, children are given Pito so that they can consume it and they can have a nutritious meal. In the afternoon, maybe the women will drink it after their day's labors. In the evening, when it's a lot stronger, men will gather around after coming in from the fields and consume Pito. And then finally, Chicha, which you guys will hear a lot about when you tour Dos Luces, is a traditional Mexican ferment. And it used to be chewed. And one of the reasons people used to chew it is we have an enzyme in our saliva that breaks down complex carbohydrates, which yeast can't ferment, into simple sugars, which yeast can ferment. But this can also be achieved by malting. And so in malting it, this is a chicha that I made for another seminar, you activate the inherent enzymes that are inside the corn, and they will produce break down those carbohydrates on their own. So just kind of to wrap up, because I think I'm right at the end of my time here. I can't believe I made it. Why are we talking about this? So, when we think about fermentation, we're thinking about things that are integral to our culture. I think if you were to open up your cupboard or your refrigerators and you were to look inside, what you would find is most of the things that we have in our cupboards, our refrigerators, are products of fermentation. Vinegars, soy sauces, Worcestershire sauces, ketchups, pickles, sauerkraut, all of these things are products that have from one generation to the next been passed down, and it's this thousands of years process through the development of human civilization that has brought us to where we are today. And the fact that we are just now rediscovering fermentation just shows how important and integral it is to the way that we live our lives and the way that we value each other and our food. And so I think with that, these are kind of my references, and I will stop sharing my screen and open it up to questions.
John, thank you very much. That was a lot of information, and you covered a range of fermented foods and into the actual fermented alcoholic drinks. I want to encourage folks to be posting questions for John in our Facebook chat, but just to begin, here's an initial question we have, John. You were quoted in Boulder Weekly, a Boulder Weekly article a few years ago, saying that fermentation is making human connections. And I think we saw some of that throughout your presentation, but could you say a little more about that?
Sure. So one of the things that fermentation requires is time. And so as you're passing these techniques, these skills from one generation to the next, it requires time spent together. And so, the fastest ferment I can think of is a ginger beer, right? Where you grate a little ginger and you mix it in sugar water and you get a ferment. But most ferments, learning how to make beer takes time. It takes time together where you're learning the nature of the substrates, where you're learning the process, and then you have the time together to watch it. And then you have to be taught, when is it ready? When is it at its peak? And then once it's at its peak, how do we stop it right there to make sure that it's at its peak for as long as we need it until the next time these resources are available to start the fermentation process over again? So, to learn how to ferment in culture takes time from a learner, and it takes time from a master or an educator. And that educator has to be willing to say, this individual is important enough for me to pass on these things that are cohesive to our communities so that they can carry it on to the next generation. And so it's that time together, it's that acknowledgement of skills, it's that connection of that fluidity from one generation to the next that really makes culture a cohesive and continuing entity in practice.
Awesome. Yeah. I've got another question for you, John, here. Peggy on Facebook asks, how can fermented products become a bridge for cultural understanding?
I think that's a really good question because there are a lot of things that are similar across cultures that are fermented, and we just don't often realize it. So with the example of Garum, if you were to which is that Roman fish ferment, that fish sauce Roman style, if we were to still have ancient Romans, they would immediately be able to recognize that in the cultures of Southeast Asia. But if we were to bring two cultures that may be a little closer together, if you were to take something like that kenke, that corn ferment that was wrapped in that corn husk that was steamed, that is something that people, I think, in the New World would be able to recognize. Those Mesoamerican cultures that would say, hey, that's a tamale. And we have certain types of fermented tamales in Latin America that resemble that ga kenke. And so by just sitting down and saying, hey, you eat this, I eat this too. You eat yours with fish, I put beans in mine. You eat yours with okra, I stuff mine with chilies and wild game. And then that opens up another door. Oh, wild game? Well, I ferment my wild game this way to preserve it. Oh, that's interesting because we have something similar and we can ferment it that way. So, these connections are kind of ubiquitous across human cultures. Fermented vegetables from, the sauerkraut of Eastern Europe is no different from kimchi or the tsukemono pickles in Southeast Asia. It's just the available resources that we use to bring those into fruition. And so, but you can recognize that process is almost identical. It's just what you put into it that makes the change. And I think that's really at the heart of developing those connections between different cultures.
Awesome, thank you. I've got some other questions, but I have to ask this question for myself. So when you look at a fermented food like stink heads or something that's consumed that's buried, and like, how did a culture first determine when it was safe to eat?
I think it's trial of error. So I often tell my students that the arc of fermentation is littered with dead bodies, right? Oh. So you have this trial and error because fermentation on the one hand is inherently dangerous, but on the other hand, once you learn the technique, is universally safe. And so that notion of safety comes from people trying and tasting. So something like stink heads. What makes stink heads inherently dangerous? It's in an anaerobic environment, which can create botulism toxin. But the way that they treat stink heads traditionally is they're dug up and they're cooked, and that cooking breaks down the botulism toxin, and so it becomes safe to eat. So somewhere along the line, as the culture developed, people realized, okay, we can't eat this resource raw. But if we cook it, not only does it volatilize off some of these undesirable aromas and flavors, but it also makes it safer to eat, and that protein resource is still alive. I've often wondered in something like miso, which has multiple fermentations over multiple different types of organisms, like how did you come to that? But what it comes to is trial and error. What makes it last a little bit longer? What makes it taste a little bit better? And over the years, you land on a product that serves the community. And so ultimately, it's those intrepid spirits who gave their lives along the way for the future of their communities that we really owe civilization to.
Wow, good news, bad news, right? Yeah. Right, John?
Yeah.
I've got another question for you related to pulque and chicha. So can you talk a little bit about the flavorings and how is pulque or chicha flavored? Is it like similar to kombucha? How do they imbue the flavors that we get in a pulque or a chicha?
So pulque I've never had. Pulque is the ferment of kind of an indigenous cactus in Mesoamerica or Latin America, and so I've never tasted that. But the descriptions that I've read is it's directly fermented. So what you're tasting in a pulque is the taste of the cactus, and then it can often be filtered through a straw-like or a grass substrate. So depending on how you filter it, you'll pull the flavors out of that. Chicha, on the other hand, is often fermented with local spices. So the corn is either soaked for a long time to become soft, or people will cook it to gelatinize the carbohydrates, and then it'll be chewed and spat out, or it'll be germinated and ground up. And then I've seen everything from oregano to agave nectar to different types of kind of locally available chilies put into a chicha. And then chicha is also filtered traditionally through a grass basket or a bundle of straw. And the flavor of that will be pulled out of there. So the chicha I made in the picture that I showed during the presentation, I made with stuff I had in the kitchen. I made it with cinnamon and nutmeg and maybe some things that weren't naturally available traditionally, but things that I thought would be delicious. And it actually turned out to be pretty good. So
awesome. Yeah, because they were available to you in the moment, right?
Exactly. Right.
I've got a question from Terry on Facebook here. Is there a standard range of alcohol percentage in the various fun fermentations of alcohols across cultures, or are they widely divergent?
So I think that depends on kind of the nature of the ferment. So when you have when you have a spontaneous or mixed ferment, what you're basically getting is a low alcohol fermentation. So a lot of these alcoholic beverages were developed to make drinking water safe. And so they were developed as an alternative to kind of drinking water out of the stream or out of a well or whatever. And so you couldn't have people that were drinking these high alcoholic beverages that you see in our modern craft brew industry and still be productive members of society. And so you're looking at 2 to 3% alcoholic beers. And so to compare that in a Western context, German beers have this category called Licht beers or light beers. And Berliner Weiss kind of falls into that. These kind of light 2 to 3% beers that are designed just to kind of be refreshing and drink throughout the day. As you get into stronger ferments, there's a cultural recognition, again, what you see during Pito, of the time that you can drink them. And we see that even with our own modern kind of Western culture. If you're drinking whiskey at noon, maybe not so productive for your community, but if you come home and you have a glass of bourbon, then it seems natural and reasonable. And I think you'll see that across the spectrum, where you'll have these drinks that you drink kind of to refresh and that are safe to drink, and then you have these drinks that are designed to make a connection to some of the religious and spiritual things, or to just have a good time and to have fun. So I think almost every culture kind of recognizes that division between alcoholic beverages.
Nice. And this will be our final question, John. Katie is curious to hear if you've eaten all the different foods that you shared in your presentation, particularly the stinkhead or the lutefisk, and if you have a favorite.
So I have eaten the lutefisk. I've never had stinkheads, although I would love to have stinkheads. In terms of my favorite, so nam pla, the fish sauce, I have it in my cabinet right now. I used it in my dinner tonight. I use it quite a bit. And then in terms of like the kenkey and the gari and things like that, these are foods that I ate a lot when I lived in West Africa in the Peace Corps. And so these are kind of foods that are true to my heart. I think I've eaten everything on that list with the exception of the stinkheads, in fact.
Yeah. Wow, that's impressive.
So I would encourage people not to be afraid to try these things. I mean, the biggest hurdle is our notion of disgust, right? When you see a century egg, it's pussy, it's greenish blue, it's got a Vaseline brown. Everything about it says it's going to kill you. But when you bite into it, you say, "Oh, this is actually a really unique and exquisite experience." And to think, the century egg is to you what peanut butter and jelly is to someone in China. And so being able to take that leap of faith and saying, this is the other thing, eating a fermented product is a leap of faith. It's saying, I trust you to make this product. I trust that it's not going to make me sick. And more importantly, I trust that it's not going to kill me. And so when you go into a culture and you eat something that's fermented, you're saying, I trust you and your culture enough to put my life on the line for. And that's another way to go back to a previous question, to make those types of connections. So I would encourage everybody to try it at least once. And at the end of the day, I mean, the worst thing you can get is upset stomach for the most part, because of the chemistry around fermentation. So.
Nice. No, that was some excellent insight. Thank you, John. I want to also thank you on behalf of our viewers this evening, on behalf of the FOCO Book Fest. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I've really enjoyed it. And I'm just sorry I couldn't see the participants, so we could have a more active dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But we could feel your energy, John, and certainly nice to have met you even in this format. And again, thank you for being with us.
Very nice to meet you. Have a good evening.
Yeah, take care. Okay, folks, our next portion of this particular session is a virtual pre-recorded tour of Dos Luces Brewery on South Broadway in Denver. Judd Belstock, owner and founder of Dos Luces Brewery, located in Denver's historic South Broadway, has been in the beer industry since he was 23 years old. His interest in Chicha and Pulque began years before he was born, when his father spent time in the mountains of Peru working with the Peace Corps around Cusco. Many moons ago, Judd met Sam Alkane, son of El Salvadoran and Cuban immigrant, who has always loved studying the unique fermented foods and beverages of the Americas. Sam has been a brewer, food microbiologist, and now is a professor of fermentation, as well as co-founder. Together, they asked the question, what if we fermented something other than barley? And this question, among many others, allowed Dos Luces to follow in the footsteps of rich traditions and ferment something different. All Dos Luces beers start with corn as the main ingredient, using blue corn malted right here in Colorado and grown as close to home as possible. They brew their own variations on Chicha and Pulque because of the rich history and depth of flavors associated with these drinks, originating with two of the major cultures of pre-Columbian North and South America. So please enjoy this pre-recorded tour, and I'll return to wrap up our session. Thank you. Doug?
Welcome to historic South Broadway, home of Dos Luces Brewery. Here we are. I always start the tours up front here. So mythology, specifically Aztec and Inca mythology, play very much into what we do here at Dos Luces. So we are a brewer of corn-based beers, inspired by pre-colonial traditions from the Inca and the Aztec. So that's specifically Chicha, Pulque, and Tepache. And you can see our Chicha up at the top, named Inti. Inti is the Inca god of the sun. And then our Pulque, kind of in the middle there, is Metzli, named for the Aztec god of the moon. So mythology really plays a key part of what we do. And it also plays into the design of the brewery itself. So the brewery is divided into three parts: the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. So I always start the tours up front here in the upper world. The upper world is, you need to think of it kind of as, it's not like the kind of Christian idea of heaven and hell. It's more three parts of our own world. And the upper world is where people come together as a community, praise, sing, and do high-minded things like that. We specifically designed the front of the brewery after a central plaza in Oaxaca. So we call it the Zocalo. You can see lots of plant life throughout, and the vines are all making their way all the way across the ceiling. And this here in the middle is a cinnamon tree. We use cinnamon in our brewing. This tree isn't quite old enough to be able to use for brewing, but we have a cinnamon tree. We also have an agave plant here. This is blue agave, which is what tequila is made out of. And over here we have an aloe plant as well. Aloe is more similar to, in the way it looks, to maguey, which is what we make our pulque out of. So if you can just imagine this being about 15 feet tall, that's kind of what a maguey plant would look like. And so when you're making pulque, you basically cut a hole right there in this 15-foot tall theoretical maguey, and let the sap accumulate overnight. And then you collect it in the morning, and after about 30 days, or doing this with 30 plants, you'll end up with enough maguey for us to make a batch of pulque. In front here, I also like to point out the artwork. So this artwork was commissioned specifically for our space by an artist out of Teotihuacan, Mexico. And it tells the story of Chicha and pulque. So you can see the maguey there and the corn over there. And we have depictions of some of the gods and goddesses that are involved. So Quetzalcoatl over here. This is a depiction of Mayahuel, the goddess of agave. She's usually depicted as having 400 breasts, so we got the PG version of her. This is Mama Serra over here, the Inca goddess of corn. And another thing I like to point out is this symbol right here. So this is a speech scroll. There's no direct translation of it into English, but it basically means singing, praising, coming together as a community, and sharing. So you can see that's a lot of what we represent here at Dos Luces. And you'll see that symbol throughout the brewery, whether it's in our logo or in the design of the brewery itself. As we make our way to the middle world is where work gets done. So this is the brewery itself. And one thing I always like to point out here is this stainless steel pipe that goes along the wall and the ceiling. And that is a transfer pipe. The purpose of that is that when we're so busy that we need to be working while people are in here drinking, rather than drag hoses across the floor, we'll be able to plug in the hoses to either side of that pipe and transfer the beer from the fermenters to the bright tanks through that pipe. I also like the poetry of it because as you walk into the brewery, you literally walk under the beer. So we have a 2-vessel system where in most European style breweries you'd see 3 or even 4 vessels. So it starts back here with what's called a hot liquor tank. The hot liquor tank is basically a giant hot water heater, and it's called a hot liquor tank because in brewing parlance, liquor is what we call water when we're brewing with it. And then over here we have a combination Mashton boil kettle. So this is a piece of equipment that we specifically designed for brewing with corn, and it allows us to both mash and boil in the same kettle. And mashing, for those who are not familiar with the brewing process, is basically soaking the grains in hot water to convert the starches into sugars. And sugars then become fermentable and turn into alcohol. And then boiling is basically a purification process. Next up over here is our heat exchanger. So this takes that boiling wort, it's about 203 degrees here at a mile high, and cools it down to about 65 to 75 degrees in about 3 seconds. And it does that by exchanging the heat on these plates. So every other plate will have wort, and then the other plates will have city water, and it'll basically trade the heat from the wort to the city water. That water then goes up this pipe here and over here and back to the hot liquor tank. And that is so that that's because we live in Colorado, where beer is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And that is so water conservation is really important, as is energy conservation. Fermenters are where the magic happens. So that's where that sugar that we remember in the mashing process, we converted the starch into sugar. And then in the fermenters, the yeast converts those sugars into alcohol. Now we use some pretty unique yeasts and bacteria in our beers. So we try the best we can to keep our fermenters separate. So designated fermenters for Chicha, Pulque, and cleaner beers like Tepache and our Agua Fresca Dura, which is a really nice beer made from Peruvian purple corn and lime. The bright tanks are the serving tanks. So these at the bottom here actually go straight down into the basement and then go straight over to the draft lines. And so when we're tapping most of our beers, it's coming straight from the tanks to the tap. So as we move on from the middle world, we move into the lower world. So the lower world is a place of quiet contemplation and solitude. So we specifically designed this after a cave in Peru. So you can see the plant life back here as well, kind of reaching for the skylights and for what light it can get. And it's a little bit quieter. We do rent this area out for private events during circumstances when there's no COVID happening. it's a little bit quieter. We also call it the brewer's table, because again, when we're working back here, if you want to sit here and watch us work, you can sit at these tables. And all of the artwork from back here comes from Peru, Mexico, and the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and Guatemala. These devil masks back here. We've had fun talking about masks with the various devil masks that we have, and the molas, which are weavings from Peru. My favorite back here is this shirt one. So traditionally, it's very traditional to find a mola woven into clothing, and this one specifically would be probably a teenager's clothes, but you can kind of see the stitching here. So the mola is designed to be removable. So you basically remove the lower part, the mola part, and put it on and attach it to another shirt as the child starts to grow up, so that you can keep this really nice, basically artwork as part of your shirt that grows up along with you. So that's our brewery. So I hope you enjoyed your time with us. I look forward to taking your questions and talking some more about the brewery with you. Make sure you come and visit us soon. Thanks.
On behalf of the 5-year celebration of the FOCO Book Fest, I would like to thank all of our presenters this evening, certainly John Wilson and Judd Belstock. I also want to make sure that I thank all our viewers. Thank you all for tuning in. Continue to check the schedule of events over the course of the weekend. I know there are some really strong upcoming sessions, so be sure to tune in for those. If you would like to purchase any of the FOCO Book Fest books, you can go to www.oldfirehousebooks.com/bookfest2020. This information is also in our FOCO Book Fest website. Finally, please go to that website and fill out the survey. We're relying on your input to continue to improve our sessions and our presentations for future festival planning. So again, thank you everyone. I hope you're well where you are, and I look forward to seeing you again.